Axel might be having some technical difficulties here.
Can you please press star 6? There you go.
By way of introduction, the 21st Century Cures Act directed NIH in collaboration with USDA and FDA to conduct a review of applicable regulations and policies for the care and use of laboratory animals and to make revisions as appropriate to reduce administrative burden on investigators while maintaining the integrity and credibility of research findings and protection of animals. Among the many initiatives proposed to reduce burden on investigators are the Compliance Unit Standard Procedures, or Cusp Project, and the Universal Protocol Template, the UPT. OLA supported the Federal Demonstration Partnership, FDP, to develop both, one which is an online resource where participating institutions can share standard procedures used in animal protocols, and the other is the creation of a user-friendly protocol template focused on required elements to ensure animal welfare and assist in institutional animal care and use committee review. Presenting today for the Cusp Project is Dr. Aubrey Schoenleben. She is the scientific liaison and review scientist for the Office of Animal Welfare at the University of Washington. Presenting for the UPT project is Dr. Ron Banks. He is the director of the Division of Comparative Medicine and a professor in the Department of Pathology at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center. Bill Greer is the primary lead but unable to attend this session. Dr. Banks, please proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf and colleagues across the country. It is good to join you today, even by the Zoom opportunity. As Dr. Wolf noted, our fearless leader, Bill, is out on a bit of leave at present and unable to join us. So I will, as second team, do the presentation update for today. I will do my best to provide an accurate and reflective status update on where the Universal Protocol template currently sits. So let's begin. David, next slide, please. The project actually began with the IACUC Administrators Association back in around 2006, 2007, where over several good lunches, many of us were talking about challenges we had at our local institutions. Some of the complexities of the protocol submission process, the challenges of effective and consistent protocol review, and then concerns from researchers who particularly worked at different institutions or when they transitioned between. Was there a way in which we could consolidate all of the necessary regulatory concerns, the important scientific questions, and the welfare considerations into a singular type document that folks could use? That began in 2006-07 and resulted in 2017 as a draft protocol template document. Dr. Wolf and others from the NIH OLA participated in those early discussions, even up through the creation of the draft, and at that point recommended that we also draw in FDP for advice, consent, and also insight into building a robust and a responsive document. And so it was proposed to FDP, and then during 2019, FDP formalized a project to see if we couldn't go ahead and build a universal protocol template. That working group has met several times since then, pretty much by Zoom, well, in certainly recent years, and have had several challenges, not at all inconsistent with what you've dealt with at your own institutions, with the restrictions of COVID, trying to find creative ways to communicate otherwise, with just life and life changes as people grow, mature, and do other things, and then other surprises that come along from time to time. David, next slide, please. Participating on the working group over time have been these people on this chart. Some of these will be changing in the near future, again, as life takes them in different directions, and others will be joining. But this was our core group to start with, our volunteers who have brought us pretty much to where we are today. Next slide. The means in which we performed the working group activities were, of course, by email, and then conference calls and Zoom meetings. when necessary and as necessary to discuss components or particular aspects of the developing document. And then to meet with FDP for meetings when that was able, updates in the project, status checks, and occasional questions as well. Next slide, please. The goal of this initiative has been to build a universal protocol template, but using a set of standards that would be applicable to any institution regardless of its administrative foundation. While we all recognize the complexity of rodent protocols all the way up to primate protocols, it seems that the vast majority of animals still are used in the rodent categories. And those are, from an oversight standpoint, some of the more easier species to effectively manage. For that reason, we opted then to try to focus the initial copy of the Universal Protocol templates to rodents and rodent users. The idea being, once this part of the project is complete, we can then circle back and do a similar sort of document for either covered species or larger species or more emotive type species than our rodents. Secondly, we wish that the protocol template include information that is needed by the IACUC to conduct the review. As part of our earlier discussion suggested that many institutions have started using the Animal Care Committee as a velvet hammer, if you will, for things involving health, for things involving other compliance activities, institutional interest and data collection. All of that was being done by the IACUC, which was really outside of the committee's purview, but had sort of developed into an industry of its own. Maybe we can trim some of that back with an IACUC specific universal protocol process. We wanted to provide as much information as possible to the PI to try to eliminate the game that we've all played for several decades called 7 questions and 7 answers. And PIs are left with the challenge of trying to match the right answer with the right question. And so the inclusion of as many check boxes or templates, SOPs, or as Aubrey will talk about in a bit, as many of the Cusp products into the Universal Protocol template to make it easier for the PI to understand what the institution expects, what is commonly considered appropriate, what could be fairly easily and simply approved. Lastly, any document needs to be user-friendly. If it's not user-friendly, then people start having challenges using it. And of course, it must be regulatory compliant. None of us want our institutions on the front page because of something we did or did not do on a template or protocol form. Next slide, please, David. And so our action plan consists of actually 2 slides. The first we'll look here consisted of thinking about every question that is required from a regulatory or a compliance or an animal care or an IACUC standpoint. First, looking to see if the question is clearly written from a PI's perspective. As we all know, words have meaning. And sometimes those words have different meanings in different cultures or different circles. And so can we write a document that requests a question written in a manner that PIs truly and simply understand from their perspective? Is the information truly necessary for the proposed animal activities, or is it just velvet hammer information that the institution needs and is using the IACUC as a tool to gather, but it really is not an IACUC function? Is the information related to compliance? Maybe that should be managed a different way, but it is also necessary to be sure that those activities stay in full compliance. Or is the information being managed by another portion of the program? Say, for example, animal care activities or medical activities through the veterinary care of the husbandry unit. Do those need to be in every single document? The second major issue is to break up the UPT into sections so that they could be dealt with independently and then build them all back together. And the sections that we settled with are research objectives and animal use, ancillary information that might be captured by an administrative office or an IACUC office or some other activity other than the IACUC proper, procedures that would be necessary, which could include Cusp identified procedures or local SOPs, any departures from regulatory expectation that should be specifically identified, and then the utilization of hazardous materials and what that might do, not just to the animals under study, but also the people who are caring for those animals under study. Next slide, please, sir. For ancillary information, the overarching question is distinguishing IACUC reviewer needs from programmatic management needs. And so if you will, name, rank, and serial number. Is the office location of the PI necessary for the IACUC, or is it necessary just for program management needs? Is the phone number of the PI or email necessary for the IACUC, or is it necessary for program management needs? And should that information be captured somewhere outside of the protocol? Protocol funding, another one of those questions that might not be necessary for a good IACUC review, and in fact may be distracting on occasion from IACUCs doing a robust review, but it still must be captured in some context. The animal activity, whether it's research, teaching, or breeding, we certainly handle breeding proposals much differently than we do research proposals. Should they also be managed differently from a programmatic or program management standpoint? Animal subject information in terms particularly of source, is that necessary? It often is in rodent studies. And is that important for the IACUC reviewer to consider? Many IACUC reviewers don't understand that a rodent from one vendor is not the same rodent, even though the strain designation is the same if it were to come from another vendor. So that might need to be managed a bit differently to assure not only compliance, but proper research foundation. And then final disposition. How will the animals be euthanized? Could be identified very easily by SOP or institutional process. Experimental design, which of those things are necessary for IACUC review? I think for most of us, we would think most, if not all of it would be. And which of these things might be better managed through a program management sort of context, through an administrative office, IACUC office, or some other entity. Locations where animal procedures are being conducted are critically important for the committee to do its semi-annual inspection, but is it necessary in the protocol proper if it could be managed in some other context to ease the process of protocol review? And then a list of assurance statements, which I think all of us probably do have, and many of us now use in sort of a checkbox or a listing format so that researchers can just affirm that they agree with that particular statement as they're going to be doing their particular research activity. Next slide, sir. Then looking at things such as research objectives and animal use, and once again, from the standpoint of distinguishing what's appropriate and necessary for the IACUC reviewer to fulfill their both regulatory job and their ethical job, and what's might be better managed from a program management perspective of an admin office or something along that line. UPT would include, without a doubt, some sort of brief discussion of the goals and a general description of the language so that it could be read by a lay person. And I believe most of us recognize that layness is really something a bit reflective of region of the country, maybe, of city, maybe, versus a more rural setting or any other sort of context. So trying to clearly identify what layness means so that our lay members can effectively review and report their opinions on particular proposals. Describe the importance of the project as it relates to human animal health. This is an inference to the ethical considerations of use for animals in research in general, and whether it is advancing knowledge and how it might be considered for the good of the overall community. Explaining the rationale for animal use and indicate why you couldn't use non-animal models or tissue cultures, organ preps, other kinds of things. And then a question on justifying why the species was selected for the particular proposed study. Are there things unique or special? And certainly cost is generally not an indicator. There might be times when that could be argued. But it shouldn't be because of cost or because they're easy to manage, or I can keep more of them in the same square footage than I can keep something else. So why indeed was the species selected, and is it the best species? That could very much be an important IACUC review question, no doubt. Next slide, sir. And so the next step was to look a little bit at some of the procedures that we all have on our protocol forms and see if there are ways in which we could maximize checks boxes, if we could reference to SOPs, or if we keep things in very reasonable and clearly defined short answers. I have just one example on the screen to consider, that being blood collection. Universal protocol template could have a statement in it such as, check here if you're going to use up to 1% of the body weight of the animal, which would be defined as 1 ml of blood per 100 grams of body weight, over a 14-day period or less. And that would be sufficient in this context for approval. It addresses the animal's need for survivability, sustainability, and it allows some flexibility in the researcher's process as well. If that's not what the researcher is going to choose, then they may very well need to describe what they do need for blood collection. And you'll see the box there for a text box, which on the protocol format would be an expandable text box where they could add additional narrative in that location. Secondly, identify the route of blood collection. And there may be certain things that are quite common at the institution, say the lateral tail vein, saphenous vein, facial vein, or even a tail incision that could be pre-approved through an SOP or an IACUC policy format, and then used as a checkbox on the universal protocol template. For some things, though, it's a bit more controversial, cardiac punctures or orbital punctures for bleeding. And those very likely would require a bit more narrative to clearly assure the IACUC that the animal is being properly cared for, that inappropriate measures are not being performed, and in fact, all the things necessary for good collection, when necessary to use these options, would be considered and included in the approved format. If there are other means that someone would like to propose for blood collection, then those would clearly need to be described. And let's go on to the next slide. And then another example might be for euthanasia. Again, this is one of those activities where we can maximize check boxes instead of playing guessing games with researchers, or we might reference existing SOPs, or maybe provide a short answer to address the point. For example, if the protocol involves adult mice or rats and they're going to be euthanized by a gas of choice, either carbon dioxide or isoflurane, then it may be sufficient to simply follow the institutional SOP with the caveat that there is some sort of secondary physical method after gaseous euthanasia has been accomplished. And you'll see the note here that this would only apply if using mice or rat, which again references that this particular initiative for the UPT is based upon those lower taxonomic order rodent species. If a lethal injection was the option for euthanasia for maybe the purpose of subsequent tissue harvest, then the PI might check the SOP box and identify which of the institutional SOPs would be applicable in this case. Or if there was no SOP, then it would be appropriate to provide maybe a bit more additional information so the IACUC could effectively and properly review what it is being proposed to do. And if none of those methods as approved and listed on the form would be appropriate, then there would be the option for PIs to go ahead and describe as well as justify another method of euthanasia that might be necessary for their particular research project. Next slide, please. We also identified potential departures that could affect animal care and use, some of those being regulatorily based. And one example might be temperatures that some or all of the animals be maintained outside of the standard range as identified potentially in the guide for the care and use. And those animals would necessarily be maintained for specific or for scientific based reasons. The researcher could check, no, that's not going to be a problem, or yes, I'm going to be maintaining some animals outside of those standard ranges. And if that would be the case, then they should specify what the proposed ranges would be, the duration frequency for continuing in that particular ambient situation, and then why it would be necessary to do that for their particular study. Next slide, sir. Another example might be for non-standard housing conditions or non-standard enclosures that could be necessary for scientific investigation for some or all of the animals in the study. And if that's the case, then let's again use checkboxes to identify exactly what the researcher is wanting to do. And if they're not going to do things that we've already discussed and have included in the template of the protocol form, then there is a box for them to identify other and more detailed describe the non-standard enclosure that they will be using. It should also include, though, the approximate duration involved on the screen. It shows a text box, yes, it shows a text box where narrative could be included. That might also be listed as a checkbox of having, say, a 6-hour, a 12-hour, a 24-hour, multiple day, or some other configuration. Now, I should note as well that the UPT would be customizable at the institutional level if there's something the institution needed to do or wanted to do for clarity, or might have been having compliance issues with and had to include in the form to assure they could effectively manage their program. And then lastly, a text box to indicate why it would be necessary to use something a bit out of the ordinary. What are the reasons that it's necessary for science, as well as the potential impact on the animals themselves. Next box, sir. We also noted one of the subject areas as being hazardous materials use. Indeed, there's implications to the animals to which those hazardous materials are being applied, but there are also implications to people who are working in those areas, our husbandry staff, for example. And their health protection is just as even more critical than the health protection of our research subjects. 3 general areas that have been identified: chemicals and toxins, and there the purpose would be to define the class as opposed to a lot of detail on a specific agent, unless there's a lot of detail known about that specific agent. But as a general sense, the class of chemical or toxins can give us a really good idea of the substantial or serious nature of that particular chemical or toxin. Second category would be those of the biologic nature, bacteria, viruses, prions, or fungi. And there would be important to know the specific strain so that proper safety measures could be effectively engaged to protect people who would be working or passaging in those areas. That would be an entry by text box. I don't think we've quite figured out how to make that a checklist option at this particular point because of the large list of things that our researchers work on throughout the community. And then thirdly, physical: isotopes, lasers, or x-rays. What exactly is being proposed? What is the purpose? What are the protections in place there? Next slide, sir. So earlier you saw action plan slide number 1, and now we've gone through several sub-components of action plan number 1, and this is action plan number 2. We've completed the thinking about the question, looking into sections and sectional components. We're now in the process of doing question reviews, and that's where I reference back to our team of volunteers who've been working on this group with representatives from the regulatory community. Dr. Wolf has been instrumental in getting us to where we are, and his insight is always helpful from that perspective, as well as colleagues of his from not just OLAW, but also from USDA. We've reached out as well to those working in the military communities, the Veterans Administration, DoD. The hope is that the UPT could be applicable even for those communities, not just the academic or the non-governmental entities. And so we're seeking insight from them on how such would apply in that realm as well. We are looking for and do have investment from principal investigators who actually fill out protocols on a regular basis to kind of get a sense on what is causing frustration, what's being misconstrued, what is exceedingly challenging to answer, and then including IACUC members, those who actually do the reviews, what things are distractors and not really a value added in terms of information that is currently being captured on the institution's protocol form. The 4th step of the process will be final document user testing, and we intend on testing that with PIs, IACUC members, compliance directors, and veterinarians. So in a nutshell, that's sort of where we are right now today in October of 2021. We're still in the question review process, going through each of those, some of the questions I used as examples in earlier slides. Next slide, please, sir. The original timeline for the project is what is listed, what is not listed on your screen, but what was listed on a prior screen of being through the review and discussion process by earlier this year with a plan of going into user testing in early of 2022. But again, due to the list of things that were not forecast when we began this in 2019 with COVID and lifestyles and other conundrum surprises along the way, we've had to extend the timeline. So now it's our intent to continue reviewing questions and having discussions on those questions for the rest of this calendar year, and hope then during calendar year 22 to get into the process phase of doing user testing of the UPT to think about ways in which it may be beneficial for the community. Next slide, David. One more slide, please. That then gives you an overview of where the working group, FDP working group on Universal Protocol template currently sits. And if there are questions that attendees have, I'll be glad to entertain those at this point.
And just go ahead and type those into the chat area.
Well, either I did an extraordinary job of describing what we're doing, or you guys are completely overwhelmed and have no questions, but I don't want to waste anyone's time, and I doubt it was an extraordinary job, so I'm sorry for the overwhelming. I'll be available to answer questions by email after the session today if you have any, but maybe we'll go ahead and pass it on to Aubrey then. and let her, yes, it will be customizable. Question from Ellen that just popped up on the chat. Go ahead and pass it on over to Aubrey and let her address the Cusp aspect of things.
Thanks, Ron. All right, so hi everybody, my name is Aubrey. I am one of the co-chairs of the Cusp Project along with Sally Thompson Iritani. And so today I just wanted to give you guys a brief overview or background on the project, since I see there's about 150 folks in this session, and I'm sure this project is new to many of you. And I also wanted to just give a brief update of what we've been up to since we last updated everybody in May. So next slide, please. So the goal of this project, as Axel alluded to earlier in the session, is really just to create an online venue or repository where participating institutions can share standard procedures that are used in animal care protocols. And our main, I guess, goal or benefit that we see from this is reducing burden, both for researchers, IACUC support staff, veterinarians, kind of everyone that's involved in that review process, by making it easier for folks to put together a high quality animal protocol and get it through IACUC review. And as Axel mentioned, this is one of the burden reducing initiatives of the 21st Century Cures Act. Next slide, please. So the working group that's come together to support this project has been nothing short of amazing. I'm always really humbled when I put together slides for this meeting and just kind of reflect on the progress that we've made so far. And since its inception, we've had 62 different institutions and more than 100 different individuals contribute to this project in some way, whether it's through attending FDP meetings or our working group meetings or filling out surveys, contributing ideas and discussion, which has been absolutely fantastic. So our working group is currently organized into 4 teams that we think will help support the site better once we get to implementation and rollout. So we have the education and outreach team, which is led by Michelle Brott from the University of Washington and Scott Burry from Vanderbilt. And they're really focused on, I guess, the PR aspect of the project and really just kind of educating our community about Cusp and the benefits that it can have for you if you can implement this system at your institution. We also have the help desk, which is being led by Elaine Kim from Colorado State and April Ripka from Penn State. And they're really just kind of your first line of help. They'll be focused on getting institutions onboarded and enrolled in the Cusp sharing site. They'll be there to answer questions from our user community and to help create help documents and FAQs that can better support our user community. We next have the quality control team, which is being led by Eva McGee from Charles Drew University and Cindy Rosenblatt from the Medical University of South Carolina. And this team is really focused on data integrity within the system and just making sure that the data that we have in there is accurate and complete. They'll be responsible for reviewing procedures that are flagged by our user community and resolving whatever those questions or issues might be. And they'll also be taking the lead on surveying our user community down the road just to see, is the site actually reducing burden? Is it meeting the needs of our user community? And are there adjustments or enhancements that we can make to better meet those needs? And then we also have the technical systems team, which is being led by Mark Nath from the Providence Health Systems. And so this team really is focused on supporting the site technically post-implementation. So they'll be doing things such as tracking bugs and fixes and enhancement requests. They'll be helping to develop supporting documentation for technical aspects of the system, such as single sign-on and development of an API or application programming interface, excuse me, and just creating documentation then that institutions can use either to implement that or to answer kind of technical questions that come up along the way. And then we also have a really wonderful group of federal partners who have been just amazingly engaged in this project, which we're so appreciative of and provide great guidance. From OLA, we have Axel Wolf and Mira Gopi. From USDA, Carol Clark has been a huge help. And from the VA, we have Alice Wong and Marissa Wolf. So as you can see, we're really big on volunteerism in our team and our working group, and we are always looking for more volunteers, because many hands really do make light work. So if you're interested, I know the help desk team, quality control team, and technical systems team in particular are looking to add new members to their groups. So if you're interested, please reach out via email. Our email is just cusp@thefdp.org. We would love to connect with you on this. Next slide, please. So I put together this little timeline just to give folks an overview of where we've been and where we currently are. So the working group was formed back in March of 2017. And so we got to work right away with putting together a project proposal that we submitted to the FDP's executive committee. And it was approved for us to proceed that October. We then spent probably about the next year and a half engaged in conversation around how we want the site to function, what features and design would be beneficial to this project. And that resulted in the development of a requirements document that we put together in June of 2019 that's currently supporting the phase that we're in now. Which is in development and testing. And so as you saw back at our May presentation, if you were able to attend that, Elaine shared with you a little demo of the beta site that we had been developing. And we completed the building and testing of that site in May. And then since that time, there have been kind of two major, I guess, events that have happened and kind of caused us to kind of steer in a little bit of a different direction. So the first was FDP's transition kind of into phase 7 and some of the strategic planning that they've done. As part of that strategic planning, there was really this vision for internal systems that the organization had, and the need really for those systems to be able to talk with one another. So these are things like Cusp or FDP's expanded clearinghouse, so tools that the organization develops, as well as just databases that helps to keep the organization running, such as membership databases, and just the need for those technologies to be able to communicate with one another very easily. The second kind of big thing that has happened since the spring was that we were able to gain funding from NIH to support a dedicated development resource who could help us transition our site over to a more modern technology stack to help support this vision that FDP has. And so I guess let's go into the next slide, please. So what does that mean whenever we say we're going to transition to a more modern technology stack? And so for me, this is a bit of an education point as well. So back in the spring, now that we had some dedicated funding and kind of a direction that we wanted to head into, we put out an RFP to identify a development resource who could help us with this transition. And we were really very fortunate to have Mark Nyland respond to that request. And Mark is, I kind of think of him as a unicorn in some ways, in the best sense possible, because he's not only got this really great experience and expertise with software development, but he also has experience managing animal care programs. So he really understands the business side of this project. And he also is really passionate about burden reduction and streamlining processes that research institutions face. So he's been really uniquely qualified to help us with this project. So that's been really fantastic to have him on board and to help us transition over. So what does this mean, this transition? So basically it's just a change in coding language. So the beta site that we showed you back in May was developed in a language called Cold Fusion. And so we're in the process then of transitioning that over to a PHP JavaScript language, which is more modern, more developers are familiar with it. So that can help us not only maintain the site long-term more easily, but also, as I had mentioned, that fits in with FDP's vision for their internal systems and the ability for all of those systems and tools to be able to easily talk with one another. So this transition is currently in process, and we anticipate that we'll start our first round of user testing this October, with the ultimate goal of completing this transition and all of our user testing by the end of the year, and then tentatively rolling out to the FDP community in January, which is super exciting. So we're going to be using an agile type approach for development. So this is really just an iterative process where you develop a little chunk of the system, you get it user tested, you get feedback and fix bugs, adjust, and then develop more test, kind of in that sort of way. And we're going to use a combination of automated testing as well as user testing, just to make sure the site is looking good. So next slide, please. So now I just wanted to give you guys a little sneak peek of where we are with development. So this is just kind of a short little video. There's no sound, but I'll do my best to kind of narrate as we go along. So David, if you could start the video. So what you see here is just kind of the welcome page or the home page when you first log in. So get, I guess we're a little bit fast. So this is the primary database where all the procedures will be housed. You can see that there'll be the procedure name, the species, the procedure type. To view procedures, we'll now have a slide in rather than a pop-up or an opening in a new window. There'll be the option then to kind of download, flag, endorse, or bookmark procedures of interest to you. So institutional representatives will have dashboards now where they can then see kind of all the procedures that their institution is associated with and what state they're in. So you can see here, for example, we have an institution that has 4 active procedures. There'll be an option then to see which ones are expiring. You can also interact with procedures from this place as well to kind of view them or edit them. You can filter, sort, search procedures associated with your institution from this dashboard really easily. And you can do that by species, by procedure type, by keywords of interest to you. And as you can see, that little table down below will then kind of update based on your search terms there. And so kind of this sort of dashboard approach will be not only for procedures that institutional representatives interact with, but also for user accounts, so they can very easily see how many active users they have, anybody that's inactive, if they have pending requests, all that sort of thing. So it's really kind of a cool, clean, modern aesthetic with some really neat new features incorporated in there. And so, okay, next slide, please. So kind of new features and functionality that's come along with this transition over to a new technology stack. So one of the exciting things is that the design now is really mobile friendly. So you can use it not only on your desktop, but you can access it, and the screen size will adjust appropriately, whether you're using a tablet or a phone, which is really cool. I know I'm often working off of a mobile device, so that's been really kind of a nice update there. We've also adjusted the account request workflow a little bit so that it is now more secure. So one, I guess, security feature that's been included in there is just having the user verify their email address before that account request is then progressed over to an institutional representative for review. This new account request workflow also makes it easier for users to change their institutional affiliation over time if they happen to switch institutions kind of over the course of their career or their interaction with the Cusp system. So that's been really nice. We're also including the ability for institutional representatives to kind of approve or deny account requests via email, and you can kind of see an example of what those emails might look like over there on the left, which is really nice. That kind of streamlines that process for institutional representatives, so they don't no longer have to log into the site to action account requests that can be really easily done via email. We're also going to include a role for QC team members so that they can log in and access a dashboard that we're putting together for procedures that are flagged for review, and then being able to assign those different flags to different members of the QC team so that they can kind of take the lead and then kind of look into that flag and resolve whatever that issue happens to be, which is really nice that we'll have that role in the system and we'll be able to engage the QC team and utilize those resources more fully. And then the last piece that we've been working on pretty diligently over the last month or two is just developing a user participation agreement for users of the site. And this will just kind of outline expectations and responsibilities, not only for individual users and participating institutions, but also outlining the role that the working group and the steering committee will have once we roll the site out and we're live. And I think that was all that I had for an update. So I think the next slide is just a thank you, and we're happy to answer any questions. So it looks like we have one from Leanne, and she's asking, are only FDP members able to sign up for access, or can other non-FDP use it too, or pay some annual access fee? So because we are developing this in conjunction with FDP, initial rollout will be to FDP members, but the ultimate goal is to open the site up to anybody that wants to use it. So that'll probably happen probably in the later half of 2022 if we stay on time with our development. And we're still kind of figuring out the details of how all of that will work, but that is the ultimate goal. Are there other questions that I can help address for either myself or Ron?